Order. Members, the House in committee resumed its consideration of the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill. Before dinner we had reached Clause 5, so the question is that Clause 5 stand part.
Mr Chairman.
Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm pleased to take a call in favour of Clause 5. Clause 5 is one of the operative parts of this legislation in that it gives effect to changes to the first schedule of the International Finance Agreements Act 1961, and that first schedule is amended in the manner that is set out in Schedule 1 to this amendment bill. It's interesting, Mr Chairman, to go back to the 1961 Act and see that what we are dealing with here is effectively the constitution of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And of course the IMF, in case we forget, is one of the institutions that was formed as a consequence of the rise in fascism, the rise in communism and World War II that resulted from the economic policies of the world in particularly the 1920s and the 1930s, when the downward spiral that various countries were in could not be recovered under the then economic management of the time, and the injustice and deprivation that was suffered by so many peoples around the world led to war. And at the end of World War II, there was a meeting of the United Nations, which was called the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which was held in July 1944, towards the end of the war. And that led to, and in fact someone else might be able to tell me whether this is correct, but I think it might have been either there or at the subsequent conference at Bretton Woods in the United States. The international community agreed that not only did they need to reform some of the matters relating to international monetary policy, but also it led to the formation of some of the financial institutions that were intended to both pursue reconstruction after the war and rebuild the economies in Europe and Asia that had been decimated by the war, but also to form the International Monetary Fund with functions that are set out in this first schedule that we're amending. And it's interesting to see that the purpose of the International Monetary Fund is set out in the first article of this schedule that we're amending, and they include to promote international monetary cooperation through the permanent institution which provides the machinery for consultation and collaboration on international monetary problems, to facilitate the expansion and balanced growth of international trade, and to contribute thereby to the promotion and maintenance of high levels of employment and real income, and to the development of the productive resources of all members as primary objectives of economic policy, and to promote stability, to maintain orderly exchange arrangements between members, and to avoid competitive exchange depreciation. And I'm going to emphasise that last matter, that one of the purposes of the IMF was and is to avoid competitive exchange depreciation. And in that regard, Mr Speaker, it falls on me to again remind the House that whilst we're considering amendments to to parts of the schedule, we have a government who's ignoring other lines of advice that are coming out of the IMF that show that existing monetary policy is no longer working for New Zealand's best interests. We aren't avoiding the deleterious effect of competitive devaluation abroad. And it's time for New Zealand to move beyond giving primacy to inflation targeting and to manage other important aspects of management. Of course, this Act doesn't touch on this because the advice function of the IMF is unaffected by these provisions, except to the extent that the funding of the IMF, which I presume is in terms of its advice function, funded from the same pool of money that is provided by governments, and that money will be invested, and I suspect they live off some of the income that they generate from that money, and I'm sure if another member has information to the contrary, they'll leap to the feet and say so. So when quotas are set as to the funding of the IMF, it's that funding funds not just some of the loan functions that we've talked about earlier, loans of money to countries that are in trouble. It also funds the IMF itself, which has this advice function, which is so important, and has whilst it's, they're never always right, if you like, no one's always right, and the IMF's made some mistakes over the years, they nonetheless have been a force for good in the world, and the Labour Party is happy to support these changes.
Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Chairman, the